railroad merger debates frequently center on whether trucking is in the relevant market. This is EconWorks. The point of this episode is that the more important question is whether the analysis of railroad freight should be a single market in the first place. Using the economics of price discrimination, we examine the differing competitive conditions faced by large industrial shippers versus small customers, and why this difference alters the way that economists should view railroad mergers.
Imagine you own a billion-dollar chemical plant.
Okay, a huge operation.
Right. And there is exactly one set of railroad tracks leading out of your front gates. You are, for all intents and purposes, geographically held hostage by a single train company to move your massive volume of hazardous freight.
Yeah, you really have no other options at that point.
Exactly. So when that specific train company goes to Washington to merge with another railroad giant, and they tell antitrust regulators, hey, don't worry, we aren't a monopoly because we compete with trucks, why on earth does the government believe them?
It is the ultimate corporate pivot. And it happens almost every time two massive freight railroads decide they want to merge.
It's wild.
It really is. The executives, they put on their best suits, sit before these antitrust regulators, and lean heavily on just the sheer visibility of the trucking industry.
So we all see trucks on the highway every day.
Right. They point out that freight moves by multiple modes of transport. They note that, like you said, anyone driving down an interstate sees thousands of trucks carrying goods. And they use those facts to argue that merging the rail networks won't eliminate competition, but will actually, create the super efficient network to finally take the fight to those trucks.
Which, that sounds incredibly appealing on the surface. Trucking carries a massive portion of domestic freight. So if a merger creates a better train network that takes trucks off the highway, everyone wins,
There's
right?
the narrative they sell, yeah.
But the problem, and really the entire reason we're doing this deep dive today, is that those facts are being used to answer fundamentally the wrong question.
Absolutely. The corporate argument relies on this massive structural illusion.
A delusion.
Yeah. It assumes that railroad freight is a single monolithic competitive market. But today's source material, which is this fascinating analytical brief from EconWorks titled The Wrong Market, the Wrong Test, Railroad Mergers and the Price Discrimination Problem, it just dismantles that illusion completely.
It really does tear it apart. And our mission today is to unpack the highly misunderstood mechanics of antitrust law, specifically how it applies to these massive infrastructure mergers.
It's such an important topic.
It really is. So if you are listening to this, whether you are prepping for a boardroom meeting or studying economics or, just genuinely curious about the invisible forces that dictate the prices of everything from the car in your driveway to the food in your pantry, this is going to completely change how you view market competition.
I completely agree. So to really understand the EconWorks analysis, we first have to discard the idea that moving a box from point A to point B constitutes a single market just because the physical action looks similar.
Right, because common sense tells you, oh, freight is freight.
Exactly. But from an antitrust perspective, analyzing railroad freight as one giant unified market is just simply incorrect. It is what economists call a price discrimination market.
Okay, let's unpack this, because grasping a price discrimination market is absolutely crucial here.
Yeah, it's the foundation of the whole argument.
I think the best way to visualize it is to look at the airlines. Think about two people sitting next to each other on a flight.
Okay.
You have a business traveler who found out on, say, a Tuesday that they have to be in London on Wednesday morning.
So zero flexibility.
Literally none.
Yeah.
They must be on that specific flight, and the airline's pricing algorithm knows it. So they pay a massive premium.
Oh, yeah, thousands of dollars.
Right. But sitting right next to them is a vacationer who booked their ticket, 6 months in advance, searched 5 different websites, and got an absolute steal of a deal.
That parallel maps perfectly to freight rail. Perfectly. When those two passengers board the plane, they are on the exact same physical aircraft.
Getting the exact same tiny bag of pretzels.
Right. They are traveling the exact same route. But they are participating in entirely different competitive markets. The business traveler is in a captive market with high prices driven by a lack of alternatives.
Well, the vacationer had options.
Exactly. The vacationer is in a highly competitive market where the airline had to really fight for their dollar.
So when a railroad sets a price, they aren't just calculating the distance or the weight of the cargo.
Not at all.
They are aggressively calculating the customer's desperation. They're looking at the customer's alternatives or lack thereof.
And this is where we have to define who the major players actually are in this space.
Hmm.
When we talk about railroads in this context, we are primarily talking about Class I railroads,
The big guys.
the titans of the industry. These are the massive, multi-billion-dollar freight networks that span entire continents. When one of these Class I railroads evaluates a customer, they segment them based on exactly what you just said, how easily that customer can walk away.
So to really see how a merger impacts the economy, we have to split this illusion of a single market wide open and look at the distinct groups of shippers.
We have to break it down.
The EconWorks brief outlines two main categories, and looking at them side by side exposes the reality of antitrust enforcement in a pretty shocking way. Let's look at the first group, small and regional shippers.
So these are your local distributors, regional manufacturers, and generally lower volume shippers. These customers typically purchase their transportation at standard posted rates.
But hold on a second. If I'm a local lumberyard or, a regional auto parts distributor, I don't absolutely have to use a train.
True.
If the Class I railroad suddenly jacks up its rates by 20%, I'm just calling a trucking fleet.
Yeah, you'd switch.
Doesn't that mean the railroads are actually telling the truth in Washington? Like, trucking really is the competition here.
Well, for that specific segment of customers, yes. Competition happens through a mechanism called modal substitution.
Modal substitution.
Right. Those small shippers can substitute one mode of transport rail for another mode trucking based on relative prices and service quality.
So they just weigh their options.
Exactly. If the train gets too expensive or too slow, the truck becomes the better economic option. For the local lumberyard, trucking genuinely constrains rail pricing.
Yeah, I see.
And standard antitrust evaluation, which looks heavily at this kind of substitution, works perfectly fine here.
That makes total sense for the small players. But then we have the second group, the heavy hitters.
The ones that really drive the economy.
Yeah. The brief lists automobile manufacturers, massive grain exporters, chemical producers, and energy companies. For these industrial giants, the game is played on a completely different board.
It is a totally different universe of logistics. For these massive shippers, trucking is practically uneconomical, if not physically impossible.
Wow, really?
Yeah, consider a unit train of grain. A unit train is a continuous block of over 100 rail cars, all carrying the exact same commodity, shuttling back and forth from a grain elevator in the Midwest directly to an export terminal on the coast.
The sheer scale of that is just mind-boggling. You can't just replace a 100-car train with a fleet of semi-trucks.
You literally can't. You would need hundreds of trucks making continuous, coordinated runs over thousands of miles. You're burning highway diesel, paying hundreds of drivers, and dealing with traffic in way stations.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It is. Doing that on a daily basis would completely destroy the exporter's profit margins. And the same applies to moving, thousands of newly manufactured automobiles out of an assembly plant.
So if a railroad raises its prices on a massive energy company, that company cannot just pivot to highway transport.
No, they are structurally captive to the rail network.
Man, so because even a significant increase in rail rates would generate almost zero diversion to trucking for these huge customers, competition does not happen through substitution for them.
Exactly. It happens strictly through bargaining.
Bargaining.
Yeah. These giants negotiate long-term, highly confidential bilateral contracts with the railroads behind closed doors.
Okay, so if these massive chemical plants and grain exporters are physically trapped on the rail network and trucking is completely off the table, how on earth does a government regulator look at a proposed merger and decide if it's anti-competitive?
It's a great question.
Like, what tests do they even use for a customer who has literally no physical alternatives?
The standard tool in the antitrust toolkit for evaluating this is called the hypothetical monopolist test, or the HMT.
Okay, the HMT, if I'm understanding the framework correctly, it's essentially an economic stress test, right?
Essentially, yes.
They pretend a monopoly already exists in a given market, and then they model what would happen if that monopoly started jacking up prices.
That captures the spirit of it perfectly. Technically, the HMT asks whether a hypothetical monopolist could profitably impose a small but significant non-transitory increase in price.
Whoa, okay, small but significant non-transitory increase in price. That sounds like a textbook lawyer's way of describing a permanent price hike.
That's exactly what it is.
Basically, if I'm the only railroad in town, can I bump my prices by, say, 5% and keep them there forever without losing so many customers to a competitor that my price hike actually loses me money?
That translation is spot on. In antitrust law, this is often referred to as a SSNIP test.
A SSNIP test.
Yeah, SSNIP. If you can impose that permanent 5% price increase without everyone fleeing to a viable alternative, it mathematically proves that the market you dominate is a distinct, defined market where you hold actual monopoly power.
Okay, that makes sense.
The HNT is designed to identify the specific market power that would be created by a merger, assuming a baseline of healthy competition existed before the merger took place.
But wait, applying that assumption to the North American rail network reveals a massive contradiction, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Across huge swaths of the continent, these Class I railroads are already operating as geographic monopolists.
Right.
Like the chemical plant in our opening scenario. Most heavy industrial facilities only have one single set of train tracks leading into their loading docks.
Yep, they don't have choices.
Right, they don't have 3 different train companies fiercely competing for their business at the front gate.
And this physical reality breaks the fundamental premise of the standard antitrust test.
How so?
Well, the HNT assumes we are starting from a competitive baseline and testing to see if a merger creates a monopoly. But for many large shippers, the analysis is beginning in an environment where substantial monopoly power already exists at the local level.
Oh, wow.
This creates a deeply uncomfortable tension in the corporate defense.
So the railroads are trying to operate as unchecked monopolies locally while demanding to be treated as scrappy competitors nationally.
Yes. They look regulators in the eye and claim that trucking constrains their pricing so strongly that trucks and trains must be placed in the same relevant antitrust market.
Which we know isn't true for the big guys.
Exactly. And as the EconWorks brief points out so clearly, a monopolist that is genuinely constrained by outside competition is no longer exercising monopoly power in the ordinary sense.
You cannot simultaneously be a local geographic monopoly, extracting maximum value from a captive chemical plant, and also claim the threat of an 18-wheeler is keeping your rates perfectly fair.
It's completely contradictory.
It's a paradox.
Which is why applying the hypothetical monopolist test to a price discrimination market produces completely different answers depending on which customer you evaluate.
So you have to split the test.
Right. If we run the HNT for the large shippers, the grain exporters, the auto manufacturers' trucking utterly fails the test. A hypothetical monopolist controlling rail service absolutely could profitably increase prices because those industrial giants have nowhere else to go.
They're stuck.
Yeah. Therefore, for the heavy hitters, the relevant antitrust market is strictly rail.
While for the small shippers, the local distributors, trucking passes the test because it provides a realistic alternative.
Exactly.
So trucking belongs in the relevant market for the small guys, but gets completely excluded for the big guys.
And this brings us to the pivotal mechanism of the whole brief. If the large shippers are already dealing with a geographic monopoly, if they only have one track leading to their plant before a merger and one track leading to their plant after a merger, what does combining 2 giant railroads actually change for them?
That's the million-dollar question. Where is the competitive harm that antitrust law is supposed to prevent?
To find that harm, we have to look away from the physical steel tracks on the ground and look at the mechanics of boardroom negotiations.
Right.
We have to dive into how bargaining leverage actually works in logistics. Let's map out the before picture. Before a mega merger happens, how does a massive shipper get a train full of chemicals from a plant in the Deep South all the way to a processing facility in the Pacific Northwest?
Okay, so historically, a cross-continent shipment like that requires the cooperation of 2 independent railroads, right?
Yes, usually.
The Southern Railroad originates the freight and carries it halfway across the country. Then they meet the Northern Railroad at a specific junction.
And that junction is called an interchange. At this physical and organizational boundary, the freight is basically handed off.
So the shipper is forced to negotiate a route that involves 2 separate corporate entities who have to play nice with each other to fulfill the contract.
And the existence of those 2 independent parties is where the large shipper derives a crucial sliver of bargaining leverage.
Because they can play them off each other.
Exactly. An interchange isn't just a place where tracks cross, it is a point of commercial negotiation. The shipper can use that boundary to play different routing options against each other.
Walk me through the mechanics of that threat. Like, how does a shipper actually use an interchange to lower their price?
Well, the shipper can go to the originating Southern Railroad and say, look, If you don't lower your rate for your leg of the journey, I will route my freight through a different interchange gateway. I will give the majority of the route's mileage and therefore the majority of the profit to your competitor instead of you.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah. Because there are multiple gateways and independent companies competing for their share of the total route's revenue, the captive shipper maintains an outside option.
The organizational boundary creates friction, but that friction is exactly what gives the shipper weight at the negotiating table. Now let's look at the after picture. The merger gets approved. The Southern Railroad and the Northern Railroad combine into one massive transnational mega railroad.
Right. And the physical tracks are exactly where they were yesterday. The train still moves from the deep south to the Pacific Northwest. But that interchange boundary,
It vanishes.
it completely evaporates. It gets swallowed up inside a single unified corporate structure. The merged mega railroad now dictates the entire movement from origin to destination.
The shipper goes from playing two companies off each other to sitting across the table from one single entity that controls the entire continent.
The shipper's outside options are eliminated. They can no longer threaten to shift mileage to a competing partner because the partner no longer exists.
Wow.
The merger removes the very organizational boundary that previously kept contract prices somewhat in check. The railroad's bargaining power becomes vastly stronger, not because they built better tracks, but because they eliminated the shipper's ability to negotiate.
It's like trying to remodel your house, and suddenly every contractor, plumber, and electrician in your city is bought by the exact same parent company.
That's a great analogy.
The work being done is identical, the physical materials are the same, but your ability to get a second quote, your ability to use the threat of a competitor to keep the price honest is completely gone.
Yep.
The leverage has structurally vanished.
And that structural loss of leverage is the profound asymmetry at the heart of the corporate defense. Let's trace the logic of the entire EconWorks brief. For the small shippers, trucking genuinely is in the market. But the rail merger changes absolutely nothing for them.
Right.
Before the merger, they chose between a truck and a train. After the merger, they still choose between a truck and a train. The competitive structure remains identical.
But for the large shippers, the ones moving the foundational materials of the entire economy, trucking completely vanishes from the equation.
They cannot use trucks.
And for them, the merger actively destroys their bargaining power by swallowing up those critical interchange gateways.
Trucking belongs in the market precisely where the merger has zero competitive effect. And trucking disappears from the market exactly where the competitive concerns become most severe.
It's a total shell game. The executives point to the small shippers and shout, "Look at all this highway competition," to get the merger approved by regulators, knowing full well the real profit and the real structural power will be quietly extracted from the large shippers who just lost their last shred of negotiating leverage.
It really is. And connecting this to the broader philosophy of antitrust law reveals a glaring blind spot in how we regulate monopolies.
Yeah, clearly.
This subtle shift in boardroom bargaining power, this quiet removal of a shipper's alternative routing options, is a competitive dimension that traditional tools like the hypothetical monopolist test were never designed to evaluate.
Because the HMT is looking for obvious sweeping price hikes and simple product substitution. It's looking to see if someone switches from rail to road.
Exactly. The standard economic models struggle to measure the slow, invisible erosion of negotiating power over bilateral confidential contracts. Market definition cannot just be about analyzing the physical movement of freight or looking at maps of overlapping tracks.
It has to go deeper.
It has to follow the deep economics of how prices are actually formed in a boardroom. Once you realize railroad freight is a price discrimination market with distinct customer segments, that familiar defense that, one, all-encompassing freight market includes both trucks and trains, loses all of its analytical force.
The corporate argument completely falls apart under scrutiny.
Yeah.
So why does the architecture of railroad interchanges and price discrimination matter to you, the listener? Because the strategies we unpack today are not confined to the transportation sector.
Not at all.
The next time you open a news app and see headlines about massive corporate consolidation, whether it's big tech platforms swallowing competitors, or those massive grocery store mega mergers that keep making the news, keep this deep dive in mind.
Absolutely.
Remember that the loudest, most public defense, the executive shouting, "We aren't a monopoly, look at all this broad competition," are almost always answering the wrong question on purpose.
True competition isn't simply about physical overlap or brand presence or, how many different logos you see on a shelf. It is about the very specific, very quiet leverage that different customers possess at the negotiating table. And the loss of that leverage dictates the rising cost of living for everyone.
Once you understand how that structural leverage is dismantled, you really can never unsee it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of antitrust law and the illusion of the single market.
Which leaves us with a lingering structural question to consider.
Lay it on us.
If traditional antitrust tests are essentially blind to these subtle shifts in bargaining power, if regulators only look at posted prices and simple, obvious substitutions are 20th century economic models fundamentally unequipped to protect consumers from the invisible boardroom monopolies of the 21st century.
That is the exact regulatory blind spot we all have to navigate moving forward. Until next time.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of EconWorks. The goal of this series is to move beyond the surface-level descriptions of how markets work and start looking at the actual architecture of competition. We'll be back soon with another look at where the law and economics meet the market. For the full technical analysis and more from this series, visit us at econworks.com. If you found today's breakdown valuable, please subscribe and share the show. It helps us keep the analysis independent. From all of us here at EconWorks, thanks for listening.